Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen and heard nationwide. Today we shall discuss a recent book that details the underlying philosophy that the executive has adopted in all arenas to fight the so-called war on terror, a philosophy aptly called the, quote, preventive paradigm, unquote, by the authors of today's book, entitled Less Safe, Less Free. With me today to discuss this book is one of the two co-authors, Jules Lobel. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Jules, again, thank you. I think this is the second time I've had you on this program. Thank you for coming up again from Pittsburgh, and you've been at our conferences and so forth, which we've always appreciated. Now, let me say that I think, Jules, that what you and David Cole, your co-author, have done here is to systematize, to elaborate and systematize what we have all sort of felt or suspected for a long time, that what the executive has done is adopted a so-called preventive approach. You call it the preventive paradigm, and it has applied that everywhere. It has applied that in war. It has applied that in seizing and interrogating people. It has applied that in intelligence work. Why don't you elaborate a little bit what you mean by the preventive paradigm, more than I have elaborated it, and how you and Cole came to understand that this is what was going on, that this is what is going on a broad range of fronts.
Well, Larry, first, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a great show, and we're running a very good law school here, which I appreciate you inviting me. With respect to the preventive paradigm, the normal rule of law, both domestically and internationally, requires that the state cannot use force against somebody unless they have objective evidence that the person has done something wrong. So, for example, if you think that your neighbor across the street is planning an attack on you, you can't call the police and they can't arrest him before he's done anything. You can't just say, well, I'm suspicious. And you know, Steven Spielberg did a movie called Minority Report, in which he says the Justice Department has hit upon a way, it's a science fiction movie, hit upon a way.
No, it's not.
So, yeah, but it's happening right now. It hit upon a way to prevent all crime. They enslaved psychic visionaries who could peer into the future and tell the police who is going to commit crimes in the future. Well, George Bush doesn't claim to have any psychic powers or psychic visionaries, certainly now that Karl Rove has left. But that's the essence of the preventive paradigm, is to use coercive force of the state, not based on somebody doing something wrong and locking them up or attacking another country because they've already done something wrong, but because they might do something wrong in the future. And so it substitutes suspicion for objective evidence. It falls mainly, it relies on double standards because it falls mainly on aliens and not on citizens. It allows the executive to operate pretty much in a void without having to be accountable to Congress, to be secret. And we've seen this in many different areas. So, for example, the war on Iraq. That is a preventive war. It's a preventive war it was a preventive war, and it was illegal as a preventive war, because we didn't say, as international law requires, that Iraq was attacking us or was imminently threatening to attack us. All we said is we're suspicious that they might have weapons of mass destruction, and they might give it to people who will attack us in the future. So too, right after September 11th, we locked up more than 5,000 non-permanent residents, aliens, not because they had done something wrong, but because we were suspicious that they might do something wrong. Or they're wiretapping people, you know, this whole NSA program. Normally, to wiretap somebody, you have to get a warrant showing that you have some evidence that they are plotting or conspiring to commit a crime. But the government said, well, we don't have that objective evidence, but we're suspicious. So we don't want to have to go get a warrant. So you could see this in a broad array of areas. And when we started putting together these whole areas, we said, underlying all this is a transformation of the usual rule of law, which says you can't, as I said, you can't use coercive power to state until somebody's done something wrong or is attempting to do something wrong or is at least plotting to do something wrong, substituting for that an idea that we will use the coercive power to state when they're just because we're suspicious that they might do something in the future.
If I may try to simplify this for myself, in effect you're saying that for purposes of criminal law, for purposes of war, for purposes of interrogation, normally we require, and the rule of law requires, evidence, some evidence of a significant character that somebody has committed a crime or may commit a crime.
Or is about to commit a crime.
About to commit a crime. That gets into imminence, which we will get back to. Now, it is true, isn't it, Jules, just to take something off the table here right away, it is true that there are a few areas, bail would be one, these Megan-type laws with sex crimes is another, where we do, in effect, punish people or take some legal action against them on the theory that they may commit a crime. Flight would be a crime. But generally, we have evidence that they have done something in the past. Either they've been convicted or they have at least been indicted.
Mm-hmm.
So
exactly.
There are exceptions.
And these are narrow exceptions. And they're narrow exceptions which still require the government to follow a clear procedure. It can't just be you can't deny bail just because the government says we want to deny bail. They have to have some proof of something, of either flight or dangerousness, which they have to present to a court. And the court has to, here they did this, all of this without any supervision whatsoever. So even in those exceptional areas, there have to be some safeguards because we recognize that when the government acts because you might do something in the future, it's very dangerous for the government to do that.
Because the government has a monopoly on force in this society, except to the extent that they're letting people like Blackwater now exercise force.
More and more they're letting private, they're subcontracting with private citizens.
Which gets us right back to the mercenaries of the Middle Ages when you get right down to it.
And private armies.
Private armies.
But what, so what we're saying is there's nothing wrong with prevention. We're all for prevention. But there's nothing wrong with the state using the coercive force to lock somebody up when you've committed a crime. But when you add prevention with this coercive power of the state, that's when you get the Steven Spielberg Minority Report scenario.
Right.
And it's very dangerous for us.
In a new book, there are several new books of great value that have come out in the last couple of months, maybe even just the last month. Yours being one, Charlie Savage's being another. Savage points out that there is a kind of combination that has been put together he doesn't call it this, but of the preventive paradigm, I will call it that, together with a claim of inherent power in the executive. What the executive is claiming, right, is it can just go ahead and do all these things, and it is not bound by law.
Well, you know, that raises 2 points. One is a lot of people, including Savage, who I think has written a very good book, talk about the executive overreaching, this idea of inherent executive power, that this president has taken a view of executive power which is extreme. And that, I think, has been fairly well discussed. I think what we add to the discussion is the idea that underlying this notion of executive power is the notion that we have to reach out aggressively, offensively, to prevent these types of acts. And you know, right after September 11th, there was a meeting of all the White House lawyers.
Yeah.
And they all agreed, as Jane Mayer pointed out in a New Yorker article, that we had to move from the defense to the offensive, move to preventive measures, and that the only model that was associated with preventive measures was a military model, because the normal civil law is sort of in tension with this coercive preventive model. So they had to move to sort of the commander-in-chief, the president being sort of the sole commander in war, and leaving Congress totally out of it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it was tied.
Yeah.
The point is that this executive overreaching is tied to this coercive preventive paradigm.
Right.
That's what we've done, tied them together.
It is based, what you're talking about is very similar, in my judgment, maybe you would comment on this, to what Ron Suskind called in his book the 1% solution, which essentially meant that Cheney took the position and his position prevailed in the executive. If there is a 1% chance that something might happen, we must act as if it's 100% certain to happen.
Exactly. And that's, I think, underlying this, that we can no longer wait for us to be reasonably certain or have objective evidence that something bad, that a terrorist act will happen. If there's a 1% chance, we've got to treat it as if it was certain. And you know, in Suskind's books, he quotes a high CIA official saying that the doctrine was one of actionable suspicion. So instead of having probable cause or objective evidence, we have actionable suspicion, which underlies this whole preventive paradigm. And you could see it in Iraq. You know, in Iraq, Cheney said, not that we are suspicious that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, because many people were suspicious. But he and other members of the administration said, we know with absolute certainty that they have weapons of mass destruction. Rumsfeld actually said right before the war, we know where they are. Right. And this, just those statements show how dangerous this preventive paradigm is.
I want to jump to something which I wasn't going to discuss until late in the program, or even on a second program with you. But the defense for all of this has been, well, this is necessary to prevent horrendous things from occurring. Now, leave aside that we didn't do this in the middle of a much greater threat to this country, which was the threat of Soviet Russia from about 1950 through about 1990. I mean, they could have, at any given time, they had hundreds of hydrogen bombs on rockets pointed at America. But leave that aside. These people say this is necessary to prevent further disasters. And that's emotionally something that human beings in this country and everywhere resonate to. In point of fact, aside from any moral qualms one might have, you are at great pains, you and Lobel are at great pains to point out, as I might say, the Washington Post has been running articles saying, this hasn't made us safer. This has made the whole situation far worse. People say, well, if you throw them all in irons, and if you invade Iraq, everything will be just fine. Well, it's worked exactly the opposite. Why don't you elaborate why you think it's worked? No, let me rephrase this, Jules. In what ways, specifically, has it made things worse rather than better?
Right. And that, I'm glad you raised that, Larry. That's our first point, is that underlying this whole approach is this preventive paradigm, and we try to understand that and explain it. But secondly, you know, the usual civil libertarian argument is, well, this is immoral or illegal or unethical, and we agree with that. But the focus of our book,
because you're the usual civil libertarian.
Because we're civil libertarians also, right?
Yeah.
And I think that argument is correct. It's immoral to torture people, even if it's going to attempt to make you safer. And I wouldn't say that we should do that. But our point really is to look at, well, whether it has made us safer, and to really come to grips with what this is actually doing. And as a practical matter, as you say, Larry, these policies have made us less safe. Let me give you an example. After September 11th, we locked up 5,200 people, over 5,000 people.
That's an amazing figure.
Which is the greatest sort of ethnic profiling. They were virtually all Muslims, Muslim aliens. And the theory of this was there could be an attack at any time. These are people who are suspicious, and we have to make sure that that we get them safely into jails.
Can I interject something? People who oppose your view will often point out, well, a large number of these people, even when not citizens, and some were citizens, had overstayed their visa time limits. But the point would be, ordinarily, that wouldn't have resulted in people getting locked up.
That would not have resulted in people getting locked up. But you say 5,200, okay? And many of them, I'll just give you one circumstance, a man by Ali al-Makhtari, who was a Yemeni citizen. He was accompanying his wife to her military base in Kentucky because she was American, and she was called up for duty. And traveling through Kentucky, people said, this is a suspicious couple. We got to be very concerned about them. Because for three things. One is she was wearing a hijab, which is the Muslim shawl. And second, they had box cutters. And third, they were speaking a very suspicious language, which turned out to be French.
A lot of people in Congress would agree with that.
Exactly. And for this, he was detained for 2 months. For 2 months in maximum security federal penitentiary, based on that suspicion. This is the doctrine of actional suspicion. You're speaking French, you're an alien, you're a Muslim, we can arrest you. Yeah. Turned out totally, and his wife was forced to take an honorable discharge from the military. But you say, okay, how many of these 5,200 people have they actually convicted? Well, maybe if they had convicted 50 of them or 100, you have some argument. You know, then you're saying, well, that made us safer. The answer is zero. Zero. Now, how has that made us less safe? You now have 5,000 people in Muslim communities where we need information about people who might really be terrorists, who are alienated, who are very mad at the U.S. government, because most people would be mad if they were taken from their families for 2 months and 3 months and on the basis of no evidence. So it's caused a tremendous distrust. 80,000, again, mainly Muslims, were asked to go down for a special registration program where they were fingerprinted, and again, this was coercive.
This is not widely known, is it, Jules?
Not widely known.
No.
No.
I read that figure in your book, 80,000?
80,000 were asked to participate in this special registration program. I think if
that would fill up the Ohio State football stadium.
It's a huge amount of people. And again, we say, we've checked the statistics, and we've said how many of these people have been now convicted of a terrorist crime. If you caught some people, it's a huge expenditure of government resources. It's again making people feel that they're being singled out because they're Muslim. But if you caught some terrorists, maybe you have to balance it. Zero. None of them. And 5,000 people were asked to come in for questioning by the FBI. Again, zero. The September 11th Commission termed this whole preventive apparatus a colossal failure. And it has not only not resulted in capturing any terrorists, but it also has resulted in alienating both Muslims here in this country and giving rise to propaganda all around the world that we're mistreating people here.
Jules, we're going to go to break in a minute, but I want to ask you a question that reflects something that's been in my mind for years, probably from well before 9/11, but I don't really remember that for a fact. And it is this. Aren't we faced with a fact, not just in the United States, but everywhere, that government is in almost everywhere incompetent? You know, call me a right-wing libertarian Republican if you want, but that's the way I feel about it. Mm-hmm. They're almost always incompetent, and they try to make up for it by extraordinary harshness. There used to be a statement about British justice back in the 1830s and before, when they would hang pickpockets. And it was that British justice was something like extraordinary harshness coupled with complete failure of enforcement. We sort of have the opposite here. We have gross incompetence, and they try to make up for it by putting 5,000 people in a slammer, by making 80,000 people register, by torturing people because they can't get they're too inept to get the information otherwise. What do you think? I mean, I'm making a statement here of a philosophy. What do you think about that?
I wouldn't want to say that government in general is incompetent, but if you look at this administration, which said you have to trust us because we are going to catch these terrorists, I do think that this preventive paradigm certainly has resulted in massive government incompetence. The war in Iraq is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's the most widely publicized thing that they were incompetent in what they did and how they went about doing it. But our point is that more fundamentally, the idea that you should be able to invade countries because you're suspicious of them will lead to these kind of mistakes. See, I think people have a misconception of the law.
That's a very important point.
Yeah.
I mean, you're essentially saying that the rule of law is designed to curb this incompetence, prevent this incompetence.
That's exactly what I was going to say, that the point of the rule of law is not just to put restrictions on the government, but to check and to ensure that the government doesn't act incompetently, particularly when they're using force against people. It's one thing to act incompetently and send a diplomat out who's not a good negotiator. That would be very bad. But it's another thing to send 100,000 troops into battle, which is not necessary. And that's what Iraq has turned out to be.
I'm going to go to Brad. I'm going to make a comment. You can comment on my comment after we come back if you wish. 160,000 troops. I think it's incompetent of the media not to understand and publicize. Only recently has it even begun to publicize. We don't have 160,000 troops in Iraq. We've got about 275,000 because all these private contractors are doing what troops otherwise would do, including engaging in combat. And this is just an attempt to fool the American people about the size of the commitment to Iraq. And it's worked.
Right.
We're going to go to break. We'll come right back. You can comment on that or on other questions, which I will ask.
Can you tell which of these children was not born free? Can you tell which of these children was not born equal? Can you tell which of these children does not deserve to be treated with dignity? We can't either. Human right number one. We are all born free and equal. What are human rights? Find out at youthforhumanrights.org. It greeted you at birth. It was there for your first step, your first mistake, your first kiss. It's with you when you win, when you lose, when you pick yourself up again. In every moment, you can feel it. Life. Human right number 3, the right to life. What are human rights? Find out at youthforhumanrights.org.
Welcome back. Jules, you wanted to make a comment about the private armies?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think over the past 20 or 30 years, the government has come to rely on CIA covert warfare to a much greater extent than it did throughout the 19th and early part of the 20th century. And so there is this trend which is continuing in Iraq, that we have troops, but that we are relying on private mercenaries, essentially, who are totally outside of the law, totally outside of any notion of accountability. And that's what we're seeing in Iraq today, that Blackwater Group seems to be going around and sees it as itself as a law unto itself.
And the regular service, the regular army does not care for these people. They've been used in New Orleans, apparently. Jules, tell me, this is way outside my area of expertise, but wasn't the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s, which created, I think it was the 1600s, which created the modern system of nation states, wasn't that in part to get rid of all these mercenary armies fighting everywhere at the same time?
Exactly. The Middle Ages had this serious problem that private groups were just fighting against each other. And from the 1600s, I'd say, to the 20th century, the general tendency, which international law and states supported, was to get rid of private armies, to centralize the control of force in order to limit the damage, in order to have the government be able to control this. What we've seen with the development of the latter part of the 20th century is CIA, same thing in the Soviet Union, that a greater resort to proxy armies or private armies to fight our battles.
Now, you know, when I make these comparisons, a lot of people tend to tell me it's too extreme and so on. Now, I don't know where I recently read this. I don't think it was in your book. But a private army is de facto what the brown shirts wore for Hitler, isn't it?
Well, that's true. I don't think, I couldn't comment, you know, on whether this is like the brown shirts, in the sense that, you know, Hitler obviously used the brown shirts for a very devious purpose. But the point is that private armies, like the preventive paradigm, is dangerous. They're very dangerous in that they could be used for all sorts of goals and actions that are beyond the purview of
I mean, that's what the Freikorps
accountability.
was in Germany in the 1920s.
Right, right.
And that's one of the reasons the government has been prosecuting these militias out in Michigan and in the western states, because you don't want people who have, you know, machine guns to be running around doing what they or their master want them to do. And that's what this Blackwater stuff is really all about.
That's what it seems like it's about, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think similar things happened in Vietnam, that they had groups operating sort of independent of the regular army that were not accountable.
Yeah, yeah. Now, in saying that, our preventive paradigm really hasn't worked. You point, well, here, let me start this a different way. Jack Goldsmith, who has recently written a book about his experience in the executive, has taken the position that a lot of people feel that no matter what else one may say, one has to reckon with the fact that there's been no attack of a 9/11 character on American soil since 9/11. You and David Cole, your co-author, take the position this proves very little when you look at what's been going on, what's been developing in Iraq, when you look at the fact that there have been major attacks in Spain and in Great Britain. Why don't you elaborate why you don't agree that the fact there has been no attack within the United States itself in, well, now we're going on 6 years, proves very much?
Well, first of all, there was no attack in the United States by Al-Qaeda from 1993, when there was the World Trade Center bombing, till 2001. That was 8 years. And I don't think very many people would say that was because of the Clinton administration's policies. The point is that these attacks occur sporadically, and it may just be the luck of the draw that it hasn't happened for 6 years. You have to look, to really get an understanding of this, you have to look at what's going on, whether or not there are more terrorists being created. If there are more terrorists being created, then it makes it more dangerous in terms of the possibility of future attacks. The fact that there hasn't been an attack for 6 years, just like in 2000, if you said we're safer because there has been no attack for 7 years, I don't think proves very much. But then you look at number one, and by the way, not just the Bush administration, but Democrats like Hillary Clinton say we're safer. But you look at the question that Rumsfeld raised. Rumsfeld said at one point in an internal memo, the question of whether we're safer is, are we killing and capturing more terrorists than we're creating? Now, I don't know if I would put the question that way, but let's just take his question. It seems to me, with the war in Iraq, there's no question that worldwide we're creating more terrorists than we have been killing and capturing. That the war in Iraq, for example, just as one thing, has been used in terms of propaganda and to inspire people who might not have become terrorists to become terrorists and commit these actions. And eventually, they'll start committing actions against the United States. Now, it is true that we have more screening measures, preventive measures, which we think are good, that don't involve force and coercion. And that probably has made it much more difficult for terrorists to engage in plots. But if you look at the preventive measures that we criticize, preventive detention, preventive torture, preventive spying, it seems very difficult to conclude that any of this has made us safer. And the fact that there hasn't been an attack, I don't think that proves very much.
Would you agree, Jules, that what was long trumpeted as a major achievement of American foreign policy, which is to say, aiding the Afghanis to throw out the Russians, has come back to haunt us dramatically? Right. And that is very similar, I gather, in your judgment, to the fact that we have provided a training ground for terrorists in Iraq.
Exactly. Iraq, before we invaded, had very little terrorist activity. Now it's ranked as the #1 terrorist haven in the world. And haven for terrorists and training, and a lot of these terrorists are first getting their experience in Iraq. In fact, there are terrorists now being trained in Iraq going back to Afghanistan. The pipeline has gone in reverse. But if you look at, right after 2001, when we launched the war in Afghanistan, we made great claims that we had finished Al-Qaeda, that all the leaders were on the run. Well, now, as you pointed out to me, the Washington Post has had a series of articles showing, and not just the Post, but a number of newspapers, that Al-Qaeda has reconstituted itself in the northern areas of Pakistan, right on the border. And there are training camps. I remember watching a TV show on this, that they actually went and filmed some of these training camps. The leadership has been reconstituted, and so we're facing a renewed threat. And it was in large part because so much of our resources have been siphoned off to the war in Iraq. So we've spent over $450 billion, and that's just by the government's figures. Who knows how much else has really been going into it. But $450 billion that has diverted our resources from combating the people who really attacked us to combating people who never attacked us.
And this is exactly what happened in Afghanistan, because we trained all these people in Afghanistan. Or we trained Osama bin Laden and, thousands like him.
What the rule of law attempts to do, going back to your prior question, is to focus the government's energy on people who are really dangerous. So people who have committed crimes, or people who are attempting to commit crimes, they're the really dangerous people that we want the government to really be looking out for and capturing. Instead of doing that, if you focus on everybody who's suspicious, what happens is you delegitimize the government efforts, and you waste resources. This NSA spying program, Bush says, well, it's helped us ferret out, terrorists. the FBI says you now have thousands and thousands of hours of tape, much of which is, almost all of which is worthless, which we now have to go through. So we're diverting our resources to going through tapes which have nothing to do with anything, because if you had gotten a warrant, then you would have, before you gotten those hundreds of hours of tape recording, you would have had to show that there's something objectively suspicious about this person. So, and the same thing with the war. There was a group that did attack us, Al-Qaeda. And international law says you could use military force against people who attack you. Now, that's a private group, you know, there's all sorts of issues, but the basic gist of it is that you can use military force to defend yourself against attacks or against imminent attacks. But to use military force against people you think might attack you in the future creates unnecessary, needless wars and diverts your resources, and it takes your military away from the task at hand, which is defending the country, to a task which is fruitless.
Jules, let me bring up a fact. I think it's a fact anyway, that I was very, very surprised not to see in your book. And I'd like to know what you think about what I'm going to say, what your response is to it. Because I thought it was the greatest imaginable proof of your point. And that is this. Because George Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and that whole rotten crowd, I guess I shouldn't call the President of the United States on television by that word, should I? But you know, Justice O'Connor is quoted as saying he is arrogant, lawless, incompetent, and I forget what the fourth word was. Or at least her views are described as meaning that. Maybe it's not an exact quote by Tubin. But because those people wanted to attack Iraq and Saddam Hussein, they failed to close off the Fourth Avenue of escape by Osama bin Laden from Tora Bora.
Right.
We had Americans on three sides. Whoever the fellow was who was in charge, I've forgotten, but I've seen him on television, I've read about what he has said. He asked for American troops to come in and close off the fourth side, the side that leads into Pakistan. Well, it led, I don't know where the others led, but it led into Pakistan. And they said, no, we're not going to put the troops there. We're going to rely on the so-called alliance. The alliance didn't want to catch this guy.
That's right.
So he got away. Now, if they had been operating on an evidentiary basis as to who caused problems, they would have made sure that fourth side was closed off. They didn't because they wanted to engage in this preventive paradigm against Iraq. Osama bin Laden is free today.
Exactly.
So how come you guys didn't mention that?
Well, I think that we mentioned the general problem, okay, and there's a lot of things like that, but the general point is they didn't finish the war off in Afghanistan because they were already planning for Iraq. And there's a lot of examples. That's probably the most prominent one, which we probably could have and should have mentioned. But another one is that they diverted translators from Afghanistan to Iraq to the point where they had no translators to decode things in Afghanistan, because most of these translators were now diverted towards the war in Iraq, and they had a limited number. So you could see that it generally diverted resources, and this probably is the prime example, the failure to close off Tora Bora. I'm not sure, and maybe one of the reasons we didn't cite it, is I'm not sure that that was directly tied to the war in Iraq, because in general, they relied in Afghanistan on these proxies.
Yeah, you're right.
You know, as a more general matter, because I think they were at that point afraid to get too deeply embroiled in Afghanistan. Now they are, but the point is now they're so deeply embroiled in Iraq that they can't, now they are totally limited.
Let's talk a little bit about the specific examples, which people will of course readily know, of how the preventive paradigm caused us, A, to make drastic mistakes with regard to Iraq, and B, to lie to the United Nations and to the world and to the American people about what the situation was with regard to Iraq?
Well, first of all, again, and this has not been really the focus of the debate. The basic point about Iraq is that we engaged in an illegal war because we did not go into Iraq in response to an attack or an imminent threat of attack against us. Bush said, well, we can't wait till an attack. You know, we can't, the metaphor they use, the imagery they use is we can't wait till the mushroom cloud because then it'll be too late. So that's their whole approach, that in an age of terrorism, we have to strike first. So what it led them to do is to be able to rely on suspicions, back to this point of actional suspicion. And that, I think, was the basic mistake. You know, a lot of commentators have now talked about the incompetence in not having enough troops, disbanding the Iraqi army. All of those things were mistakes and aspects of incompetence along the way. But the basic problem, as a Middle East diplomat said, is when you drive a car up a one-way street the wrong way, you're going to have trouble. You're in for trouble. You don't know what's going to happen. A truck might come the other way.
I got stopped by the police once doing that.
But you're gonna have trouble, and that's what this was like.
Yeah,
that's what this was like.
So it led to these, because it didn't have to be evidence-based in the sense of provable evidence. It led to lies about nuclear weapons, lies about chemical weapons. If you read James Risen's book, and I'm sure you have, so it's rhetorical, the CIA had sent numerous people to Iraq who were American citizens but would come from Iraq and whose close relatives or close friends were Iraqi scientists, and they all come back and there are no weapons of mass. They're laughing at this over in Iraq.
Well, they relied on a guy in Germany who was an expatriate or something like that, whose code name was Curveball.
Yeah.
Because the Germans thought he was so screwy.
Yeah.
And this was the guy they relied on for a lot of these claims of chemical and biological.
So they made this stuff up. Whereas your point would be, I guess, under the rule of law, you have to have
some objective evidence that the country is planning an attack against you.
Yeah.
And I think the idea behind this is to prevent what was thousands, you know, literally there's a big history of preventive war, which we have a chapter on in the book.
Right, I'll get into that in the next segment. Go ahead.
But it's to prevent that from reoccurring. We know that preventive wars throughout history have led to millions of people dying in needless battles and needless wars. But you know, it wasn't this idea that this was Bush lies, you know, and Cheney lies. They, in my opinion, did lie because they said, not just that they believed that they were weapons of mass destruction. If they had said that, I think they might have been truthful, because many people believed they were weapons of mass destruction. But to convince the American people, they said we're absolutely certain. That was, I think, the lie. But the big point that we make is that it's not really the lying. That's a part of the problem here. That this was a bad crowd who lied to us. But that the whole preventive paradigm allows even people who honestly believe that there were weapons of mass destruction. It might be that Powell actually might have believed that there were weapons of mass destruction there. It allows people to base judgments about the most serious thing a nation could do, go to war, based on hunches and suspicions and predictions. And we should not go to war based on that kind of evidence. I think that's the basic point that should come out of this Iraq war, and not just that this crowd was liars, because many of the Democrats went along, like Hillary Clinton went along.
They're not very truthful people either.
Well, they may not be very truthful people, but whether or not they were truthful or not, it was because it may have been that some of them believed that there were weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. And the point I would have made to them then, and would make to Clinton now, is it didn't matter whether you believed that. That's not the reason that we should go to war. We had an inspectors team there. Blix said every time they made a claim, we had inspectors go track it down, and it turned out to be phony. why didn't Clinton and the other Democrats who voted for this war say, we're not going to vote for war except on the basis of some evidence that Iraq is planning to attack us? And you have nothing like that. So to focus simply on the lying, I think, is a mistake. You have to focus on the broader problem, which is starting wars because we're suspicious of what other countries would do. It would be as if we had in cities in the United States people who had a license to go into your neighbor's house and shoot them because you're suspicious that they're going to come and attack you. We don't allow that domestically, because
The whole thing comes down to evidence.
it comes down to evidence, and not just evidence that you have weapons. Because if there evidence you have weapons, that it might be that you have to do something about that. You
Yeah.
should do something seriously. But that's different than saying you have evidence that they're going to attack you.
Yeah, evidence of will as well as, which is always very hard. That's the hardest evidence to obtain.
That's number one. It's the hardest evidence to obtain, and psychologists have done studies. There's been scientists who've done studies on this, which is that when you believe something, and this isn't just this crowd in the White House, but anybody,
Yeah.
when you believe something, you will accept the evidence that proves your point, and you will reject
Right.
the evidence that is against you. And so that's why we require some overt act, both in domestic law and international law, that the country has to be moving its armies to the border or preparing or something like that, and not just evidence of intent or suspicion.
Jules, I think that what you're, before we go to break, maybe you'll comment on this. I think what you are raising in terms of what the psychologists have shown, which is a common sense, really, particularly to lawyers who deal with this problem every day, is sort of at odds, if you will, with the philosophy of the Age of Enlightenment. Or you could say it makes it even more important that people do what they can to overcome the prejudice by using the philosophy of the Enlightenment.
Well, your point, I think, is that the philosophy of the Enlightenment is that reason can produce good decisions, and I agree with that. But on the other side of it, you have that in emotional crises like September 11th, people will be driven to find proof of what they emotionally believe. If they think that Saddam Hussein was behind September 11th, they'll believe anything. And by the way, many Americans still believe that Saddam Hussein was behind September 11th, even though the evidence shows that he had nothing to do with it. They will find evidence of this, and it'll drive them to make emotional decisions that are inaccurate. And what we say in the book is that this is why you have to be, in those situations, even more careful, to have procedural checks, to have legal checks, because the idea of the rule of law is that reason sometimes fails us because of these kind of emotional factors. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't trust our emotion or we shouldn't do anything, but we have to have even stronger checks in that time to ensure that we don't go off the deep end.
Yeah. We're going to go to break. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Professor Jules Lobel. Welcome back. Jules, you mentioned that in the past there have been wars begun for preventive purposes. And I can think of one that ended up rather well for the country that started it, and that would be Israel in '67. Although God knows that the long term, there are people like Ben-Gurion who foresaw that the long term would be a disaster. But on the other hand, Israel had evidence it was faced with an imminent attack. But the number of wars, how should I put this? Maybe the Israeli case is the aberrational case, because the number of wars that you and David Cole talk about that were begun by one nation or another, starting way back with Athens and Sparta, going on to Carthage and Rome, and then going to some more modern wars, the number of times that the nation that's attacked for preventive purposes ended up in disaster is really quite remarkable. So maybe you could elaborate some of those times, starting maybe with Carthage and Rome, because everybody knows a little bit about something. They know there was a Carthage and a Rome.
Well, let me first say one distinction that we have to draw, and it's important for the Israeli example, which is that a preventive war is different than a war fought because you're facing an imminent attack. Now, both of those are anticipating violence against you, as opposed to when the tanks are already rolling in your. But international law permits anticipatory self-defense in the sense that if another country is imminently going to attack you, there's a good argument under at least customary international law that a nation can respond. And that's what Israel claimed to do in 1967. That's very different than a preventive war, where it's, you don't, like the war in Iraq, where you don't have a sense that the other country is about to attack you. But you say, if we don't attack now, at some point in the future, the other country's going to attack us. Israel was not faced, at least its claim, was that it wasn't faced with that situation. It was faced with an imminent attack in days or in weeks, and they launched the attack first. Most preventive wars that we talk about in the book, the preventive, are ones where the country says, we are facing a grave threat, and this other country will attack us eventually, and therefore we have to strike first. And I'll give you two modern examples. The first is World War I. World War I was launched by the Germans under the theory that the Russians and the French were eventually going to attack it. And Russia was getting stronger, and the German high command believed we have to move now.
Can I interject something? My understanding is that the German high command was very concerned because A, the Russians were building up their railroad system so they could move troops quickly to the front, and B, they were building up their army to an even larger army than it already was.
That's right. And there was, at the time, fear in Germany that war was inevitable, and we better start it now. Now, we never know whether, you never will know whether war was inevitable. What we do know happened is the slaughter of millions of people. And it might have been preventable. And that's
in effect, if I may interject, you're saying one of the reasons, or maybe the major reason why Germany gave Austria the famous blank check was Germany figured, we better get rid of the Russians now before they get too powerful with the French so that we can't get rid of them.
Exactly. That was their thinking. And you have, I went and looked at the letters from the foreign secretary to the prime minister, et cetera, and you get this theme throughout. Another case in American history is Japan. Japan believed, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, that the United States was squeezing it during World War and that Roosevelt was eventually going to try to help the British and get into war with Japan. So they said, we can't wait for that to happen. We're going to launch the Pearl Harbor attack. Now again, we never know what would have happened. But we do know that at the end of it, Japanese cities lay smoldering in ruins, and Japan had lost 1 million people, and there was it was a terrible blunder. So that's more recent examples.
Well, didn't Hitler declare war on the United States to Roosevelt's great relief? Because he thought the United States would come anyway at some point, so now that Japan's attacked them, we might as well declare war on them. And didn't he also go into Russia for something of the same reason?
Exactly, and they went into Norway. Hitler, was a great believer in preventive war.
Was it?
Yeah, and Hitler said we have to go on the offensive. We have to attack all these other countries before they're going to attack us. And at Nuremberg, the high Nazi command made a defense with respect to their attack on the Soviet Union and their attack on Norway, that this was a legitimate preventive war, that their suspicions would have turned out correctly, and the Allies rejected that kind of self-defense because, again, if you allow that, you're going to allow constant warfare, and that's what happened throughout the 19th century. The scholars of the 19th century said that virtually every European war in the 19th century and the 18th century was preventive in nature. The country that started it didn't say, we're under attack, we have to. The country that started the war said, they're going to attack us sometime soon, sometime in the next few years, and we better attack them.
That was more or less the same theory as the domino theory that we used in Vietnam, was it not?
Yeah, we've had preventive war reasoning, but the United States, at least officially, and I don't think the official reasoning has often been the real one, but officially has always tried to rely on the idea that the country attacked us. So in Vietnam, we said the North Vietnamese attacked us. It was Hokie, we now know. But that's
the
what
Tonkin Gulf resolution.
The Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
And the best theory is that was entirely hokum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That
as you say, you'll never know
lie.
for sure.
But we didn't claim, as this Bush crowd has claimed, that we could go to war simply because we thought that North Vietnamese would eventually attack us. Or that the North Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Soviets would get so powerful they'd take over all of Asia.
But that was the key point, though, wasn't it?
That was what they
underlined. If we don't stop them
underlined
now, they'll keep going. Thailand,
Exactly,
Cambodia,
exactly.
all of it.
But we at least fabricated incidents there.
Yeah.
Now, in my opinion, the best example of this, of the rejection of preventive war, was President Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now there was clearly a much more serious threat than what Iraq posed. But we did not use preventive war, even though the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended that we attack Cuba, get rid of these missiles. Kennedy said, Robert Kennedy said, now I know how Tojo must have felt,
Yeah. And Jules, I again read, maybe it's in Charlie Savage's book, something that has now been known for about 15 years. I've read it several times. Had we fought a preventive war, there would have been, beyond question, World War III. Yeah. Because the Russian commander on the scene had operational authority already to fire tactical nuclear weapons if we invaded Cuba. Right. And all he had to do is fire those tactical nuclear weapons, and you can bet there would have been a full-scale nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States.
Well, here's a case where we don't know what would have happened if there had been a war, although we could surmise that millions of people would have been killed. But we do know what happened by the wise rejection of the idea of attacking Cuba.
Yeah. Jules, we have to wrap up this segment. We're going to have, let me tell the audience, a second segment with you because there are all kinds of very, very important questions raised in your book that we have not yet been able to discuss today. So we will come back and we will discuss those questions on the next segment of Books of Our Time.
It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you.